Hi, I want to talk about something called the burning time. It's a common phrase usually used among Wiccans, but also other witchcraft and occult orientated group. And it's alleged to denote the period in history where 6 million witches were burned alive and persecuted by the religious groups at the time. Now, this is very commonly heard when I was in America. I'd often encounter an American Wiccan, and she inevitably would say, well, we went through the burning time when 6 million of our sisters were, burned alive at the stake by the Catholic Church. And I see this repeated a lot online, and it's completely false in so many levels. It is not accurate history in any way, and it's used as a kind of an emotional crutch for people like Wiccans to believe that there's some kind of oppressed minority. And they will attach it to things that are somewhat relevant and irrelevant, such as the Salem witch trials and so on. Now, the real fact is the 6 million witches were not burned alive by the Catholic Church. And this is complete and utter falsehood. They use the word 6 million because it has the same emotional gravitas as victims of the Holocaust. And so they know that the number 6 million has a certain sort of like feeling it generates in people. And they use that 6 million as well. And this is not exclusive to Wiccans, other groups do it as well. And they claim that, it's the same number for that reason. Now, while the number wasn't 6 million, let's talk about the real number. The real number was, if you take from the period of the English Witchcraft Act on, this would be under Queen Henry VIII first. It was rarely enacted in England or Scotland, but it inspired other similar acts in the Presbyterian world. And you're talking about maybe tens of thousands of people. We don't know the full number. And the reason for this is they happened during sectarian wars. It may shock people to know, especially the Wiccans, and especially the people who were put to death, being called witches, as most of them were either devout Catholics or Protestants who found themselves living in the wrong neighborhood during sectarian wars, during the worst parts of the early days of the Reformation. So this indicates that the number of witches that were even burned as witches was incredibly low, that were actually, on genuine charges of witchcraft. The charge of witchcraft was generally leveled at someone on the other side, be they a Catholic or a Protestant, as an easy method of taking them out. It was a way of kind of saying, well, no further evidence is needed. A lot like McCarthyism and calling someone a communist during those days, or even today when someone questions the certain medical treatments, they're instantly declared a conspiracy theorist. Well, it's the same kind of idea. They would take these people, and these were often very devout Presbyterians that would find themselves in a Catholic area, and they would call them witchcrafts, or accuse them of witchcraft, or prosecute them based on having a English or a German translation of the Bible. Conversely, on the other side, because of the fear of the Jesuits in the shadows, Catholics who found themselves in Presbyterian countries during these phobias were also charged with witchcraft. It didn't take much to connect the rites of the Catholic Mass, particularly things like the transubstantiation, with that of witchcraft. They saw the priests' altar as the same thing as the witches or the magician's table. And it's very interesting stuff, but when you really get into it. Now, the myth that the Catholic Church persecuted these people is not true at all, really. The Catholic Church, for the most part, in those times, didn't really have an interest in witches. In fact, this is why, and I'm kind of, as an Irish person, I'm proud to say this, we had almost no persecutions of witches in Ireland compared to, say, across the sea in Scotland, which is a Protestant country, Calvinist, where it was carnage, it was absolutely horrific. And even in England, you could see that the authorities didn't like pursuing charges of witchcraft. They would avoid it if they could help it. And this is why the Pendle witch story stands out, because it's so rare within English history that an entire family were all wiped out by accusations of witchcraft at a time when there was a phobia in the country following the gunpowder plot, and this belief that Jesuits were trying to take over England and kill the king, who was James II, who was a Calvinist and a fanatical witch hater. If you want to look at where the persecutions of genuine witchcraft existed, they were in the Protestant countries. In fact, Catholics, Protestant witches would often escape into Catholic regions because there was no real phobia regarding witchcraft. You see, what happened was after the Protestant Reformation, the Calvinists and the Lutherans, they had this belief that the Old Testament must be taken absolutely literally. It's not, parable, or it's not allegory, a metaphor. It's an actual word of God, and everything in it, including the prohibitions against witchcraft, were 100 legitimate and had to be pursued. So therefore, they went after witches, genuinely, not just only because of sectarian wars, but also because of religious phobia. Now, it's a very interesting thing. Now, the majority of the witch persecutions happened in Presbyterian countries, predominantly Lutheran and Calvinist, not so much Anglican, although it did happen when James came down from Scotland, as he had been, educated and raised in the Scottish kirk, so he brought that fanaticism with him. The main countries where the genuine persecution of witches happened would be Denmark, Sweden, Finland, to a lesser degree, but it still existed. The northern part of the Germanic world, the Protestant Huguenot areas of France, some of England, and particularly bad in Scotland. Almost nothing in Ireland and other Catholic countries, because the simple reason that the church, once you didn't try to start an alternative religion, the Holy See didn't particularly care about witchcraft, and they also saw it as a kind of a social safety valve. A lot of these people who couldn't afford an able doctor, witchcraft, herbalism, and so on was the only hope they had. And this is why in Ireland and in Portugal you have the traditions of, in Ireland, the Shan Van Vucht, the wise old woman, and in Portugal, the Muras Enchantadas, and that was also in parts of Spain as well, of the witches basically. Mostly healers, but they also had the ability to, do witchcraft. Often it was to discard spells and remove spells and things like that. So when Wiccans say that 6 million of their sisters were burned by the church in Europe during the burning time, they're being completely inaccurate. They weren't. It was, when you say church, you have to be specific. It's predominantly, in terms of genuine prosecutions of witchcraft, was Presbyterian countries. Catholic countries were very relaxed, and Catholic regions were very relaxed regarding witchcraft. It was just seen as folk magic. Even in England, like, you had the cunning folk in Catholic areas, and even Protestants would, depending on their degree of fanaticism, would tolerate it too. The ordinary people would tolerate it. Now, it was so bad, this notion within the Presbyterian world, that you actually had witch prosecutors who were hired as consultants. The Danish, in particular, were incredibly brutal towards witches, to the point where they were actually, hired as consultants in other countries to help us deal with their witchcraft problem. And you think, if you watch films with, like, Vincent Price, Witchfinder General, or you Trask in the old TV show Dark Shadows, and you have this concept of this fanatic, bug-eyed, screaming, Puritan witch hunter. It wasn't like that at all. These people were incredibly, to the rule of the law. They were often, men who considered themselves logical and reasonable, young magistrates, and they would actually go to lengths to help the witches. And it was all to the rule of the law, and they would be like sitting there, promoting the most bizarre prosecutions, but doing it to the T of the letter of the law. And they're making sure the witches got a fair trial. This is why, even in England, prosecutions of witchcraft until King James came along were almost zero. Most people would be acquitted, and death sentences very rarely handed out. The max would be a prison sentence, which could also, in those days, would be like a death sentence, but a lot of it would be just fines, or the pillory, that kind of thing. So 6 million witches did not die in the burning time. That did not happen. They were not sentenced to death by the Catholic Church. They were sentenced to death predominantly, if they were real witches, by Lutheran or Calvinist controlled regions, Protestants, that people who were worried about being done for witchcraft would escape into Catholic regions for safety, because Catholics weren't particularly, Catholic papacy wasn't particularly bothered. They didn't have the same obsession with the Old Testament that the Lutherans and the Calvinists had. And the vast majority of people who went to their fires or to the hanging as witches were generally just devout Catholics or Protestants, and it was a handy excuse to get rid of a political target. So the next time you hear them going on about the burning times, it's completely false. It's complete. I mean, even within Protestant regions, in certain areas, depending on the kind of local magistrate you had, witchcraft continued in form of folk healing and things like that, and cunning folk long after. It was seen again by a sort of progressive magistrate would see it as like, well, these people have nothing, so they can't afford able doctors, so let them do their herbalism and all that. So once they don't start trying to take on the government. So basically, just about everyone who was prosecuted and sentenced to death for witchcraft during the so-called burning times were devout Christians, either Catholics or Protestants, on the wrong side of the Reformation neighborhood. And the ones who are genuinely convicted and charged as being witches was predominantly in Protestant countries, predominantly, overwhelmingly. And if you were a witch in a Catholic region, chances are you were completely left alone. No one would bother you. So I hope that's undone some of these myths that you hear from these people. And also, it's also disrespectful. Now, I'm a pagan, so I'm not, singing any Christian thing here. It's disrespectful to people who died as Catholics or Protestants to call them witches when they were not that, or to exploit their deaths, which is exactly what's being done. Just like the 6 million numbers exploiting Holocaust numbers for emotional, gain. So there you go. The burning times, mostly a Wiccan myth.